It begins unexpectedly. Jesus' mother and siblings have come to take him away, believing that he is out of his mind. It's not the picture of his family that I generally have. Luke tells us that at his birth, as shepherds speak of angelic visitors, Mary treasured all these words in her heart. In John, she stands at the foot of the cross, despite how heartbreaking that would have been. But in Mark, rather than loving support, we get a delegation sent to lock up their family member. Similarly, the religious leaders accused Jesus of being in league with the devil, prompting Jesus' speech about a divided house not being able to stand. So what was Jesus' great sin that prompted this concern? Healing people? Proclaiming forgiveness? Reaching out to outcasts? Breaking the Sabbath? Yep. And most importantly, in the previous chapter, he spoke of new wine needing to be put into fresh wineskins. He made it clear that his actions were not going to be some gradual reform of the status quo. Rather, God's reign will only come if we shake things up. And on a very practical level, this distressed Jesus' family. Shaking things up such that the authorities said he was in league with the devil, that he was demonic, wasn't doing the family any favors. He was squandering their chance to better their social position. How could they curry favor with future patrons by having a celebrity in the family if that same celebrity kept on antagonizing their social betters? No wonder they wanted to lock him up. And yet this disruptive aspect of Jesus is something we so often overlook. So much so that over our history, the church has been less inclined to shake up the status quo than to shore up the status quo. And that's the case when it came to Indian residential schools, a partnership with the government that made possible the heartbreak of 215 children buried in unmarked graves at the school in Kamloops. And doubtless we will discover made possible the undocumented deaths of hundreds more across the country. Now, this isn't to deny that schools had some dedicated and loving teachers, that it had members of the United, Presbyterian, Anglican, and Roman Catholic churches who thought they were doing a good thing, who viewed the schools as a way to help Indigenous children assimilate into Canadian society. But we all know that a policy grounded in the assumption that Indigenous peoples were savages, even in league with the devil, that they were culturally, spiritually, socially, even intellectually inferior to descendants of settlers from Europe. That kind of policy is bound to attract people who will be disrespectful, abusive, and dare I say, murderous. Add in perpetual underfunding, the rejection of recommendations to improve conditions, students used as test subjects in experiments, and you have this incredibly sinful chapter in Canadian history. Now, I blame much of this on a misguided fear of racial diversity. In our reading from Mark, Jesus says that neither a kingdom nor a house divided against itself can stand. And at the time of Confederation, just such a reality had played out south of the border in the American Civil War, at the cost of 750,000 soldiers killed and as many injured. Even though the conflict was well over, there was fear that emancipation of those who had been formerly enslaved, that emancipation would bring social unrest. There was a widely held belief that countries should be culturally and racially homogeneous. And so racial and ethnic diversity should be minimized. The population of minority groups capped at 1% of the total population. Fear of a race problem led our policymakers to legislate against non-white immigration. And among other policies, to have fixed quotas of Caribbean workers, to impose the Chinese head tax, to bar Sikh immigrants from disembarking the Komagata Maru. At Confederation, 5% of Canada's population was comprised of Indigenous peoples. And so, according to the logic, means needed to be found to dilute this population and encourage them to be absorbed into the dominant race. It boggles the mind today. And yet there is enough anti-immigrant, anti-BIPOC sentiment to say it was not just some antiquated idea from the past. Fear of division, well, it makes us keep blaming the wrong causes. And so to keep proposing the wrong solutions. And Jesus, in his closing words today, makes clear to me where the solution lies. When the delegation of his family arrived, he turned to the people in front of him and asserted that whoever does the will of God is his mother, his sister, his brother. He didn't designate who was in his family based on blood or even by religious, cultural, or social bond. God's reign comes when we shake up long-held divisions and instead look to what we share in common. And from that commonality, seek to create a world where everyone is respected, where there is equity, where everyone has what they need to thrive. And evident by the outpouring of grief across Canada at the discovery of graves in Kamloops. One of many things we all share in common is love for our children. And so the belief that nothing is more important than keeping our children safe. Well, both the government and churches failed in that regard when it came to Indian residential schools. And the only way we can atone is to ensure that Indigenous children now are treated with equal care as children of other backgrounds. And it's well documented that's not the case. The federal government continues to underfund education, health, housing, and other supports compared to equivalent provincial services. And litigates to ensure they keep on getting to do so, despite affirmations of nation-to-nation relationships. And so as followers of Jesus, I believe that we're still called to shake things up, which means in this case, holding our government to account for their actions. Friends, today we are taking time to honor our various RHUC grads, as well as to reveal who's been a secret friend to last year's grads. We do this because in this congregation, we believe education is a very high good. May that commitment to our children's learning be a motivator to ensure that every child is treated with the same love and support. It should be obvious. The fact that there's still iniquity says that gradual reform is not enough. In our gospel today, Jesus' family thought he lost his mind because he didn't want gradual reform, but wanted to shake things up. Well, tragically, our failure as church to do just that contributed to the tragedy not just of Indian residential schools, but countless racially prejudiced policies in Canadian history. If we are going to be followers of one who wasn't afraid to challenge authorities, who wasn't even afraid to challenge his family, may we be ready to shake things up, to shake up the status quo. God's reign depends on our doing so. Amen.